Hello team, welcome back. And today we are going to discuss a very important topic, data provider. So we will see what is data provider in TestNG, what is the use of data provider in TestNG, and what is the importance of this particular data provider in TestNG. So I would like to mention before starting the lecture, this is a very important lecture for those people who want to create a data driven framework either in Selenium or REST API, because data provider is the key of all kind of data driven test cases. It is the key of all kind of data driven frameworks. Either they could be in the Selenium or they could be in the rest assured. So let's start with. So first we will try to understand what is data provider. So basically, as we have already discussed in the previous lecture, data provider is used to supply the test data to test case, which is the key of data driven testing. Data provider is also an annotation in the TestNG, which is attached with the method that returns the dataset in form of two-dimensional object array. So when we are basically implementing the data-driven testing, we will create a function in Java that will return the two-dimensional object array, right? And we will attach at the rate data provider annotation with that particular method. Then why we need two-dimensional array, right? So in the two-dimensional object array, the first array represents the data set, right? First array is representing the data set. This is dataset 0, dataset 1, dataset 2, dataset 3, dataset 4, or up to n number. And the second array is basically actually supplying the values, that these are the values of the dataset 1, these are the values of dataset 2, these are the values of dataset 3, right? So we have two-dimensional object array. The first array is simply representing the dataset number, and second array is simply representing the specific data which is related to that particular dataset number, right? Because it is quite possible you want to execute your test with different datasets, right? So every dataset have their own number. For example, if we take a real life example of Facebook automation, then suppose you are automating the Facebook registration page, right? And you want to register 5 users in a similar way with different details. So in that case, if you are not using the data driven testing, you are using the hard coded test data inside your test case, then you need to write down the 5 test cases for this with different data, right? But if you are using the data driven test case, then you just define a single code for all 5 registrations, right? But you need to supply 5 set of data. That first set will execute, then second set will execute, then third, and then fourth and fifth, so that all 5 users will be registered with the same code. This is the data driven testing, where data is basically driving your test case. You have a single test case, but it's up to you. Either you want to iterate the same test case for n number of iterations, but it is up to you if you want to iterate the same test case for 10 number of data, 11 number of data, or n number of data, right? So in the same example, if I will define 10 set of the data set, then the same test case will register 10 user on your Facebook, right? So this is the data driven testing, where data is driving your test cases, which is very important in the automation. Because if you are going to do some kind of work 5 times, 6 times, or n number of times, then it means we don't need to define n number of test cases for that particular thing, which is reducing my coding effort plus maintenance effort. So we just need to define the n number of test data set, and the same code, the single code, will execute n number of times for that particular data, right? So this is the data driven testing. And the complete data driven testing in automation, if we are using the TestNG, then it is based on the data provider. So we will see how we can design the data provider, and when we will learn about the framework, we will see how we can use the data provider to read the data from external factors like from Excel, from database, and other services. So as we have already discussed, the data provider is the key of data driven testing frameworks, right? With in absence of data provider, data driven testing is quite complex for the automation engineers. Data provider is a very helpful feature in a TestNG which will help us to automate the data driven test cases. Now we will discuss how we can use the data provider, right? So data provider method can be present within the same test class or one of the parent test class, so that we can easily inherit that particular method, right? If this is not possible and the scenario is my data provider is present in some other class, right? Then we need to make that particular data provider method as a static so that we can access that method without the reference of the class, right? One more thing we need to understand about the data provider. Now let's open up the Eclipse and see how we can use the data provider, how we can implement the data provider, and how we can iterate my single test case against multiple set which is present inside the data provider. So let's start with. So let's open the Eclipse. So here we are on Eclipse and we are in the same project on which we was working, my TestNG project. First, I will create a separate package for this particular data provider and I will name my package com.testng.dataprovider. So we have created the package com.testng.dataprovider. Now suppose I'm going to create a new class over here and I will call my class test parameter example. So we have created the class. Now suppose over here we are creating a test case which will accept two parameters, two integer values and verify these values, right? So first we will declare a test case and I will name my test addition, which is accepting two parameters, int a and int b. And this test is accepting two parameters, int actual and int expected. Over here I am declaring another integer actual value, and inside the actual value I am taking the actual and adding some number in it, like I'm adding 20, right? Then I put assertion, and over here I'm comparing the actual value with the expected value. So I'm comparing the actual value with expected, right? And I will declare this thing as a @testng test. Now I'm getting some error, so I will import my testng annotation. That's it. So what I'm doing over here, this is my test case. This is accepting two parameters, actual value which is integer type and expected value which is integer type. Inside my test case, I'm adding something inside my actual value, right? And after that, I'm putting assertion with my actual value to my expected one. Now this is a single test case and I want to iterate this test case with 5 number of data, right? This is my requirement that I need to check this particular logic with 5 number of data. So there's two ways. Either I can hard code this particular data and write down 5 test cases, or I can just write down a single test case and then write down a data provider and provide the data set inside the data provider. Now we are going to implement the data provider. So I will declare a method which will return two-dimensional object array. So public object, and it is two-dimensional array, and I will name it get data, right? So this is returning two-dimensional object array. So I will put return statement, then new, create the object of two-dimensional, right? And then pass the array values. So suppose I am passing the first array like 100 and then expected is 120. Because I am adding 20 in 100, then expected value would be 120. Then another like 200 and expected is 220. In the same way I am passing 250 and expected would be 270, right? Then I'm passing like 300 and I'm expecting 310 instead of 320, right? And then I'm passing another value like 400 and expecting like 420. So we can see out of this we have a one incorrect result, right? So this test code will execute 5 times. The 4 test cases will be passed and one test case should be failed, right? So we are going to provide this data. Now I will close this simply and I will put @data provider annotation on it, right? So @data control space and it will import the data provider testng annotation. See, right? So please make sure you are importing the data provider annotation from the testng annotations as well, right? Now I will save my program and I will simply execute this particular Java file. Then you can see we are getting the error cannot inject @test annotation method, which is genuine one, because over here we are passing the parameters, but we are not defining any data provider inside my @test annotation, right? So first I need to define the data provider here as well, and inside the data provider put double quotes and provide your method name, which is get data, right? So by this particular way, I'm telling my method that this test is accepting some data provider, and data provider is get data method, right, which is this. And simply save your program and execute program. Go to run as TestNG test. So you can see there are total 5 runs, out of them 1 failure, right? If we will go over here, then we are seeing the result that passed test addition 100, passed test addition 100, 200, 220, passed test addition 250, 270, passed addition 400, 420, and failed with the 300 and 310, right? So we can see we just define a single test case, but the same test case is running 5 times because we have 5 number of data sets, right? So this is the way how data driven testing is helpful. If I will hard code this particular data, then I need to define the 5 test cases, but with the help of the data provider, I'm just adding a single row inside my data provider, and the same test case will iterate again for that particular row as well, right? So this is the way how you can use the data provider in your TestNG, right? Now let's move further. And the another point about the data provider is user can also provide the data provider name by using name attribute, right? And if we are not providing the name attribute, then the data provider method name can be used, right? So let's see how we can provide the data provider name and how we can use the data provider with the help of the name. So suppose I am defining another data provider in my same class. I will copy it and paste it over here, and this is get data set, right? But I'm changing my values, like I'm telling 10, then I'm making the expected is 30, then I'm saying 20 and expected is 40, and that's it. Let's remove the rest part of this particular data provider. Now I can define the data provider, and to this I need to define data provider and name, right, equals to double quote, and I can provide any string over here, right? So I suppose I'm saying double set. Save my program. Now what I want to do, I want to execute this particular test case with this particular data set, right? So there are two ways. Either I can provide the method name, right? Either I can provide the data provider name like double set, right? So this is the name of my data provider, and over here I am providing the data provider double set, right? So by this way we can define the name of the data provider, and we can use the data provider in my test case with the help of the name as well. If I will execute this program, then this program will execute twice, first for 10 and then for 20. See, the program executed twice. First it is executing for the 10, then it is executing for 20. So by this way we can also define the data provider name and use the data provider on the basis of my name only, right? Now let's move further. Now this is the another important point of data provider, which is use data provider with I-test context, right? Now first we will try to understand what is I-test context. So user can use I-test context to determine what runtime parameters the current test method was invoked with. It means the I-test context is used to determine what kind of parameters the test is using, and on the basis of these particular parameters we can pass the data set to that particular test case. So we can use the I-test context when we have a multiple test cases and we want to use the same data provider for all these test cases, but all these test cases need different kind of data. It means we have a multiple test cases but a single data provider, right? And all tests are using different kind of data from the single data provider. In that case we can use the I-test context with data provider. Now let's see how practically we can use the iTest context with the data provider, right? For this, we need to open the Eclipse. And now suppose we want to design three kind of test cases: the unit test cases, acceptance test cases, and integration test cases. And on the basis of the test case name, I need to read the data from my data provider. For this, first we'll declare a class and call it data provider parameter example, right? So we have created a class data provider parameter example. To save your time, I'm going to declare the test cases first, then I will explain you directly, right? And inside my class, I have defined the three test cases like scenario 1, test scenario 2, and scenario 3. Like all the scenario test cases, all the test cases is basically accepting the single parameter which is string kind of. And over here I'm printing something like scenario testing data, common scenario testing data, right? Till now I didn't define any data provider over here. Now I am going to create another class data provider acceptance example, right? Which will accept only acceptance tests. So another class is being declared over here, and I will declare another test method over here. So in the same way, I have declared another test case acceptance test. This is accepting a single parameter and simply printing the value, right? I'm not doing any kind of direct implementation of Selenium or rest assured over here. I'm just taking the simple example so that I can actually explain the use of data provider, right? We will talk about the actual scenarios when we will learn about the rest assured or Selenium frameworks. In the similar way, I will declare another class data provider integration example and simply declare a similar case like this, right? So create a new class data provider integration example. And in the similar way, I will declare another test case over here, and test name is integration test, which is also printing some data. So we have declared three test classes. First is data provider example, in which we have the three tests, which is accepting the scenario data. Then we have the acceptance test. Then we have the integration test example, right? We have discussed that with the help of iTest context, we can declare the test specific data sets. So I'm going to create a new class, which will be a data provider class, right? And I will name my class data provider source. So I have declared a new Java class data provider source. Over here I'm going to declare a new data provider which will work on basis of the iTest context, right? So team, I have declared two data providers over here. First is scenario data and second is test type. So you can see we have declared the static kind of data because this is a separate class, right? This class, this data provider class, is not a parent class of these three classes which I am going to execute on this particular data. So I have declared the static kind of data, and over here you can see this data provider is accepting a parameter which is iTest context, right? Which is an interface in the TestNG, and I take the reference like a context for this particular iTest context, right? Over here I'm declaring a string test case, and from the iTest context I am basically getting the name. So what this will return me? This will return you the test case name, right? iTest context dot get name will return you the test case name, and I'm comparing this particular test case string. If the test case name is scenario 1, then return this. If test case name is scenario 2, then return this. Else return common scenario data. In the same way, I have declared another data provider, which is again a static kind of data type, and I'm doing the same thing. I test context, right? Then test name, getting the test name on the basis of context, right? Checking if it is integration level, then if it is integration level, then we need to define the integration test data. If this is acceptance level, then we need to define the acceptance test data. So team, you can see I have declared two data providers over here. The first data provider is named test type and second data provider is named scenario type. But there is a new thing which we are seeing inside my data provider. that this data provider is basically accepting a parameter I test context. And also this is a static kind of data provider. So why we have the static kind of data provider? We have already discussed this thing. This is the data provider which is not a parent class of my three test classes, so that this is a static kind of database, so that this method would be called on the basis of my class name only, right? Now why we are using the I test context? Because we want to fetch the test case name at runtime. So we are declaring another string test name, and on the reference of I test context, I'm executing a method get name. So what this will return me? This will return you the test case name, right? Then I'm putting a condition. If test case name is integration level, then return this. New object, return this. If test case name is acceptance level, then return this. Else return common data. In the same way, I have declared another data provider, and this is accepting the method. Now what is the difference between I test context and method? When I put method dot get name, this will return you the name of your actual method, actual test case method name, right? It means if we are talking in this particular scenario, then this will return me the scenario, right? Scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario common scenarios. If I will put on this particular class, then this will return me the acceptance test, right? This method dot get name. And on the basis of this method dot get name, I am providing the return type, that if the scenario 1, then return this. If scenario 2, then return this. Else return common scenario data. So you can see over here we are doing two things. First, we declared the data provider in a separate class, right? Second, we declared multiple data providers in a single class. And third, we are basically returning the data on a basis of test case name and test method name, right? Now we just need to define how we can use these particular data providers. So to use these particular data providers, I will go to my test class and put data provider, right? Colon, then provide the data provider name. So this is the scenario 1, scenario 2 and common scenario. So I need to use the second data provider, which is scenario data, right? But this will not work because this is not present in a same class. So I need to put a comma over here, and after this I need to define data provider class equals to provide the class name, which is data provider source dot class, like this, right? Over here I'm defining that data provider is this scenario data, and this is the data provider class, data provider source, right? So we are defining the complete address of data provider and data provider class. I just need to copy this and paste this in every test method where I'm using data provider. In the similar way, we want to use the first data provider test data type, because over here I'm checking the test level name, integration level or acceptance level. So where I defined the acceptance one, I will define the first data provider. Over here I change my data scenario data to test type, right? Save your program, copy this complete line and paste it in your third class inside the @test annotation, right? So this is the way we have defined the data provider in a separate class. We have defined two data providers, and we have configured the data provider in a way that this particular data provider will return the data on a basis of method name or the test name. Now one more thing we need to remember, or we need to notice over here, this will work fine because this is accepting the test case method name. But how this will work? Till now we didn't define any test name in my testng.xml file, because inside the testng the test name is defined inside the testng.xml file. So I need to create a separate testng.xml file for this. So I will go to my project and create a new file and call it data provider testng.xml. Now I will open any testng.xml file and paste it inside my data provider testng.xml file. Now I will amend this particular file. So I will remove the groups. I will remove the complete test as well. So right over here we have the suits only, and I will rename my suit to data provider suit. Now over here I need to define the three test labels: unit test, acceptance test, and integration test. So I will define the first test and name it unit test. Inside my test I need to define my classes, right? Inside the classes you need to define your class, and over here you need to provide a fully qualified path of your class, right? So suppose inside my unit test I need to define this particular class, data provider example. So I simply copy the full path of my class, which is com.testng.com.dataprovider. My class name. Fine. In the same way I will define two another test cases. The first one is acceptance test, then the integration test. For this I will copy the test case name from my data provider. So this is integration level and acceptance level. So I will copy the integration level, go to over here, instead of the unit I will type integration level and provide the path of my integration level test. So data provider integration example. Copy this name, go to your XML and replace this file name with your integration file name. In the same way the third test is acceptance level, right? So I will go to my data provider source, copy the test name, go over here, modify this, go to the acceptance, copy the class name and modify the class again, right? Save your testng.xml file. Right now we are all set to use the data provider and all three classes, right? Now simply click your file, right click this and run as testng suite. So you can see total 5 test case executed, which was expected because we have the 3 tests in my first class and single test in my another class. First test which executed is common scenarios testing, and you can see it is reading the data from my data provider because inside my data provider I defined this particular data, common scenario data. See, common scenario data, right? Now why it is running the common scenario data? Because over here I'm defining the method name, right? Over here I'm defining the method name, and over here it is using the method name like common scenarios. So first it check that method is scenario 1, no, scenario 2, no, then put this. Simple, right? Now then it is printing scenario 1 and scenario 2, which is based on your method name. Over here we have the method name scenario 2 and scenario 1, and we are using the same inside my data provider source, right? Scenario 2 and scenario 1, right? Now it is accepting the integration testing and acceptance testing test, and you can see it is reading the actual data which I just defined inside my data provider. And over here we have the test level defined, which is testng reading from your testng.xml file from here, right? So simply if you are using test context, then it will work on the basis of your test case name, right? If you are using a method, then it will work on your test method name, right? So in this way, if you have a different set of data for unit level testing, acceptance level testing and integration level testing, then you can use the test context. If you have a different data set within a same data provider, but you want to execute your different data set on the basis of your test method, then you can use the method inside your data provider, right? So we have seen a lot of things about the data provider. So this is a quite lengthy lecture today. So team, if you have any question, any concerns regarding the data provider, then please put your question inside the question and answer forum and I will answer your questions, because this is very important topic from a data driven point of view. So please carefully go with every aspects which we have learned today. Thank you team, thanks for your time.